Good afternoon and welcome to the workshop. So today I want to talk about fine scale, because a lot of the things that I do on this channel are related to what is charitably known as fine scale modeling. And so probably the easiest way to explain it is to demonstrate some examples. So if we turn over these two wagons, which look pretty similar, this is one that I've weathered, and here's one that's unweathered. We turn them over and I put them up to you like this, you'll see that there's quite a difference in the wheels. I got my little pointer. So you'll be able to see that the tyre on this wheel is twice the width of this wheel. It's quite hard to see because these are quite small models, but you'll see the lip up here, the flange this is called, is much larger on this model down here. So this is a fine scale version of a set of wheels, and the fine scale standards are essentially refuting the toy-like nature of the models. Because if you think about it, model railways, at least initially, were primarily toys, and they were marketed as such for a long time, and there are a number of compromises that came in because the manufacturers were either not focused on them being scale, or if they were, there were the perceived limitations. So one great example of this is here is a Pico Code 75 curved point. You can see it looks fairly reasonable, but in fact it's wrong in all kinds of ways. Behind you, I'll be able to show you some flex track, and so this is the Pico Bullhead flex track, and you'll see the sleeper spacing on this item here is much more akin to what we would see in the real world than here. It's because this is built to the wrong scale. This is built to 1 in 87, which is a European or American size, and this track here is 1 to 76. And indeed, the models that we model and that we have on our layouts in 00 gauge are 1 in 76, so they fit this. But you'll notice that the width of the tracks is identical. So remember, this is 1 in 87, and the tracks are this wide. And this is 1 in 76, and the tracks are the same width, which essentially means that these tracks are too narrow to represent the real distance. So behind, I've got another set of flex track. And now, if I put this towards the camera like so, you should be able to see a slight difference. It just seems a little bit unfamiliar, like you're walking into a house and someone's moved your favourite book or something, and you don't really know what's different, but you know something's different. And the easiest way to show the difference is to compare it directly to a piece of Picoflex. So hopefully you can see the difference. I certainly can. This here is about 2 millimeters wider in gauge than here, and this is a standard called EM for 18 mil. In fact, it's 18.2 mil instead of 16.5 for the normal Pico and Hornby track. So EM was created as a standard that's intermediate. If I have EM is, when it was proposed, was quite a distance from the current standards of the time, but now EM wheels, in the way that I showed you the bottom of these wagons, EM wheels are very close to modern production wheels. So what we can do is we can go one step further and we can look at a scale and gauge called P4. So this locomotive here is a Lima class 33, and inside it I have put in EM gauge wheels. So it will run, if I have this set up okay, this should run in theory on this track here, which it does. It's making noises, but that's the right scale and gauge for that track there. One level up from that, and I say up with a wry smile on my face, is P4. Definitely in terms of accuracy. Now, again, it's going to be quite hard to tell because these differences are quite small. But you see this model over here, the wheels are incredibly narrow. And on the left, on this one, they are slightly wider. and that's because EM is even more fine. I'll try and rotate it so you can see the wheel flanges, and they are truly tiny. And P4 is a gauge of 18.83 millimeters. That's right, it's 100th of a millimeter in accuracy, and that is the pièce de résistance, the tippity top of the accuracy scale. But this P4 locomotive won't run on this EM gauge track, and this EM gauge locomotive won't run on this 00 gauge track. So it's a scale where you start to have to be more and more accurate with your track work, because you can't buy track work off the shelf in EM or P4, although Pico offer, I think, a couple of items through the EM Gauge Society. Generally you can't buy anything, so you have to make it yourself. And if you're making it in 00, like this, you can be a little bit flexible because the tolerances are quite high. If you're making it in EM, then you have to be a little bit more accurate. And if you're making it in P4, you have to be the most accurate. An example of some fine scale point work is this. This is a single slip, which I built in 2mm fine scale. So if you look, the gap, look, this is my size of my finger, the gaps here are 0.5 mm. The rail head is 0.5 mm wide as well. And this is just a diorama. This did function, and then I decided to just make it into a diorama, and that's what this is here. But you can see there's a very fine level of accuracy required to even join the party to make something like this. But what you do get is much more flowing track work. So if we return to my notional Pico curved point here, you can see that it seems reasonable, but then you start to look and you go, well, down here, this isn't anything like a real point. They don't have this mechanism here. They don't have this bar going across. These timbers aren't bigger on a normal point. These bits here, these rails should be one piece, and the whole rail should move. But you can see there's a pivot in this point here where it switches. Down here, this ginormous insulating gap here in the middle. These wing rails are tiny, and the gap is in this section here is huge. If you compare, I know it's 2 mil, so it's the equivalent of N gauge, but if you compare the size of the gap in that little hole there with over here, then there's a huge difference, even if you just scaled it up. So an example of a point in fine scale, I'm just going to, the current project I'm working on is this. Now this obviously is a three-way rather than a single point. Sorry, just whacked that thing. But you can see how much smoother this is. So it takes up much more space, but it's so much more natural. And so you can get away with, because you're not buying stuff off the shelf, generally people lower their expectations with regard to what they're going to build. They're not going to build a layout that fills an entire room. They're going to build one that fills up a shelf. But every single part of it can be very finely put together. So I'm looking forward to building this track work and getting that done. So hopefully that was a good summary of what fine scale is. If you've got any questions or comments, please let me know.